Today I'm going to be sharing a message that is entitled The Unity of God's Multi-Ethnic Family. And I like this topic because my own family is multi-ethnic. I'm originally from Brazil. My wife is French-Canadian. So we have a very multicultural home. And today I want to talk to you about what the Bible has to say about unity in a multicultural context. But we're going to start by going back in history to the early part of the 20th century. World War I broke out across Europe after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria on June 28 of 1914. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28. One event and one extreme person's choice changed the course of the whole world for several years to come. On August 3, 1914, Germany declared war on France, and Europe was divided, and the several years to come saw incredible bloodshed, violence, and death throughout Europe. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire made up the Central Powers, and they fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States, the Allied powers. Both sides were counting on a short, decisive conflict that would end in their favor. You will be home before the leaves have fallen from the trees, is what Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany assured his troops for the front in the first week of August 1914. Now, what I want to highlight today about World War I, we're not going to get into too many details, is that the cradle of this horrendous war, which killed around 20 million people, had been the center of Christianity for centuries. This terrible conflict that ended in so much death and bloodshed was the center of Jesus' movement. And that should be sobering to us as Jesus followers. This was in many ways a war that was at the very heart of Christianity. In 1914, of the estimated 560 million Christians in the world, 68% lived in Europe, compared to only 14% in North America. A number of Christian leaders across Europe advanced the cause of war and state-sponsored violence. The rhetoric around World War I included religious rationales, which official churches played very important roles in heightening the ideological hatreds during the conflict. What I want to tell you this morning is that the hatred between the French and the German, which were the two major powers on both sides of this war, was often fueled from the pulpits, the Christian pulpits of those two respective nations. For example, the Anglican Bishop of London, now the British were on the Allied side, and of course they were with the French in their struggle against Germany. His name was Arthur Winnington Ingram. He preached to his congregation in 1915 and said, "Everyone that loves freedom and honor are banded in a great crusade, we cannot deny it, to kill Germans. To kill them not for the sake of killing, but to save the world." Sermons preached from Christian pulpits throughout Europe played a key role in shaping public opinion about the war. French pastors argued that German militarism was the continuous outgrowth of the same Teutonic barbarism that had destroyed the Roman Empire. German pastors preached that German culture was in fact the true preserver of eternal values in the face of the atheism of the French Revolution, which had unleashed destructive forces in the late 18th century, leading in their point of view to the present war. But I want to tell you today that not every Christian pulpit during World War I was fueling the flames of war. I want to tell you about one particular pastor. He was actually, in the 20th century, considered one of the most prominent Christian theologians. His name is Karl Barth, and he was from Switzerland. And if you know anything about the Swiss, they're made up of French and German, and that's why they were neutral in World War I and World War II. On August 30, 1914, 4 weeks after World War I broke out, Karl Barth, 28 years old, a young pastor in Switzerland, preached a sermon based on Isaiah chapter 30, verse 15. It was entitled, "In Quietness and Hope Shall Be Your Strength." Barth preached amidst tensions between the German-speaking majority in Switzerland, that was his background, who tended to sympathize with the Central Powers of Germany, and the French-speaking in Switzerland who sympathized with the French. So you could see that the country of Switzerland was in a very vulnerable situation with the potential of polarization happening right in their society, because you have the French and you have the German in one nation, and you have the French and the German nations warring against each other. Switzerland is neutral, but you have people on both sides of the conflict in one country who have sympathies for one side of the other. And what does a young pastor do in such a situation? Well, I've been inspired by Karl Barth's sermons during this very complicated conflict in Europe. For example, some of the things that Barth said from the pulpit that was very counterintuitive and unpopular at the time. The present war is largely a racial conflict. Ancient antagonism between the German and the French. He understood the tendency of human nature to tribalism. My tribe is better than your tribe. My people are better than your people. Barth pointed out to his congregation that the present struggle is a power struggle regarding who has or should have first place in Europe. He continued, now the hidden power struggle has come out into the open. This was something that was festering for decades and even centuries. Barth wrote and preached in his sermon, we should not and do not want to let ourselves be confused because of the many prayers and much talk of God that are heard far and wide. Regarding the invocation of God on both sides, he said. See, both the French and the German and the English, they were all calling on God. They were all considering God to be on their side. And they were all fighting what they believed to be a righteous battle with God on their side. He said in his sermon, and let us not forget that God shows himself as a master very different, perhaps, from the one who is prayed to on both sides. Barth believed that the God who was being prayed to was not the true God. He said, it is simply out of the question that God helps the Germans or the French or the English. God helps justice and love. God helps the kingdom of heaven, and that exists across all national boundaries. God is working across all national boundaries. The foolish mixing of patriotism, war enthusiasm, and Christian faith could one day lead to the bitterest disappointment. By the way, study Germany during the 1930s with the rise of Hitler, and you see that Barth was speaking very prophetically. This is exactly what would end up happening in Germany during World War II. For no nation do we desire victory or defeat. We hate no one. He's speaking as a Christian. We hate only the war and the selfishness and pride that have ignited it. Now, nearly 20 years before Karl Barth preached his sermon, long before World War I began, a woman named Ellen White wrote in the United States, "Christ in the German believer will recognize Christ in the French believer." You understand the significance of that statement, especially in the context of what was going to happen? Because when we become divided over artificial boundaries such as ethnicity, skin color, or even national identity, we start viewing others as them and those who are like us as us. And that inhibits us from seeing Jesus and the Spirit of God working on the other side. And we're very prone to imagine that God is always on our side. And today we can see that maybe across political divides in our own nation. Anne Lamott made this statement: "You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do." We want to be careful not to create God in our own image. God created us in His image and for a much nobler purpose. Today I'm going to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Romans chapter 14. And we're going to just look at one of the most powerful chapters in Paul's writings, I believe. Romans chapter 14, Paul is dealing with this very issue of unity created by the Spirit across national and ethnic boundaries, cultural boundaries. The Spirit of God is able to work and unite people of different backgrounds. This was a huge, huge challenge that we cannot underestimate in the first century. Rome was the capital of the empire, and Rome was a multicultural city. There were many thousands of Jews in Rome and many people from many other nations of the world in Rome. And somehow the gospel of Jesus, which began in the city of Jerusalem in Palestine among a people of Jewish ancestry, a movement that began in Jerusalem somehow found its way throughout the Roman Empire and even to the city of Rome. The earliest Christians, the apostles, Peter, James, John, and many of the others, they were Jews. And there were Jews living throughout the Roman Empire, and many of them would come to Jerusalem for the festivals. And on one particular occasion, after the resurrection of Jesus, there were Jews in Jerusalem who lived in Rome and other parts of the empire who were there, and they heard the preaching of Peter, and they became followers of Jesus on the day of Pentecost. We read in Acts chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, that there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven, including visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes. And so in the city of Rome, you have Jews who have accepted Jesus on the day of Pentecost, and they take with them the message of Jesus. And so we don't know a lot about how the church in Rome grew, but we know that it started with Jewish followers of Jesus. And then when we read Paul's letter, by the way, Paul was in the city of Corinth. It's right there in between Jerusalem and Rome on the map. You see there Corinth, which was a church that Paul founded, and he's in Corinth, and he writes a letter to the Christian churches of Rome. Paul had not been to Rome. Paul had not visited the churches of Rome, but he knew about the church of Jesus in Rome, and he's writing, as we read Paul's letter in Romans, to a multicultural church, meaning a church made up of Jews and Gentiles. Gentiles, people from all the nations outside of Judaism, and Jews, Jesus followers who were descendants of Abraham. So you have in the church of Rome a mixture. When you read Paul's letter to the Romans, and by the way, Paul is the apostle of the New Testament to the Gentiles. Paul is the one who took the gospel of Jesus to many cities throughout the Roman Empire. And when Paul writes to the Romans, though he had never been to Rome, and though he was not personally acquainted with the churches of Jesus in Rome, he knew about them. And when he writes the letter to the Romans, you find that Paul is writing to a multicultural church, meaning a church made up of Jews and Gentiles. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul writes that the gospel is for the Jew and also for the Greek. Throughout the letter, Paul keeps making this statement. For example, in Romans chapter 2, verse 9, are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged, we have already summarized that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. It's one of the points that Paul makes in the letter to the Romans, that Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles, are all infected by the sin problem, meaning that they all need the same solution, which is Jesus. In Romans chapter 3, verse 29, is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. When you read Paul's letter to the Romans, you get the impression that there is a problem that may be stirring among Jesus' followers in the churches, including the churches of Rome. And that problem is tension between Jews and Gentiles. And it seems like there may be the potential for Jewish superiority on the part of those who were Jesus followers, who were Jewish culturally and ethnically. And then as you continue reading Paul's letter to the Romans, you also find that there may be this potential of Gentile Christians despising and separating from Jewish followers of Jesus. And Paul has a vision, has a goal for the church, which includes unity. Understood this, and in Paul's letter to the Romans, as we get to Romans chapter 4, and the Jews can congregate in these homes, and that's how we can keep loving each other. When you read Romans chapter 4, it was an impossible task, a task that could only be accomplished through the power of the Holy Spirit. And as you keep reading through the letter of Romans, and we're not going to do the whole letter today, his riches on all who call on him. I forgot my Bible. Honey, could you grab my Bible for me? We're going to go to Romans chapter 14 now. And I'd like for you to just his whole doctrine of justification by faith without the go multicultural. But do you want a potential for conflict? Go multicultural. That's just how it is. a defense for that today. I needed because the idol is nothing. The idol has no power. In order to not offend your weak brother who may have a conscience. When he refers to the weak conscience, he's referring to the conscience that makes people feel guilty over something. God is up there frowning on them. And so Paul makes an appeal in 1 Corinthians 8, avoid eating foods offered to individuals who are very conscientious, very scrupulous, and very concerned about offending God. One who was constantly offended if we do things wrong and constantly appeased if we do it right. And Paul says, the one who is weak in the faith, welcome him. Now, what does it mean specifically address them as Jews or Gentiles? But what you have in the churches in Rome is very simply two types of Christians. Testament, and it was based on instructions God gave through Moses as to what constitutes clean food and unclean food. And it's not just about what kind of animals you can eat or cannot eat. Vegetarianism, many of them would eat meat under most circumstances, but they were never sure whether the type of meat. And Paul is saying, the one who believes he may eat anything, and the other one who eats only vegetables, which is remarkable. Are you ready for this? Paul is saying that we can disagree and still welcome, largely to do with culture and even religious, conscientious stands on practices that are rooted in culture. Many interpret it that way. Sunday worship is not something that is an issue this early. Religious observance of days and holidays that might have been issues of contention among early Christians. There were holidays and days of observance in a pagan context and also in a Jewish esteems all days alike. Now, Paul's talking about Christians here. Paul is saying that there are some Christians that observe certain days, and other is an appealing to the churches in Rome to be united, to welcome one another in spite of differences. Expression, doubtful disputations. Another way of putting it is, it would be like gray areas. But if I'm in Brazil and I know that every person in that congregation is going to stumble over me wearing or not wearing that tie, what do you think I'm going to have on? It doesn't really have the best and most flattering origins. So then you really get into trouble. Because in some places, why the New Testament is full of letters, pastoral epistles, mostly written by Paul, appealing for you to believe to be right, follow your conscience, and sincerely serve the Lord according to your conviction, and don't impose your... Paul does draw the line. Dealing with sexual immorality, Paul does not say, let every person be fully persuaded in their own mind. The church does have standards, or what type of music you listen to. They were moral issues, and we have to figure out what constitutes a moral. There are many people who believe our churches should be monocultural, meaning we need to have American churches, we need to have Black American churches, we need to have Brazilian churches, we need to have Korean churches, we need to... For linguistic reasons, they may be justifiable, but this is the rationale. Monocultural churches. Really, the Messiah is demonstrated through our unity across cultural and ethnic boundaries. But the rationale goes like this. Churches grow faster. It's not enough that we've divided ourselves ethnically and based on skin color and culture. Now we want to have youth. Home of an early Christian group in the 1st century in the Roman Empire, you would find a slave and a free person eating at the same table together. You would find a... Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, same pews. And yes, there will be differences. Yes, there will be cultural and sometimes even religious convictions that differ. But in Paul's mind, we Abraham's descendants. Genesis 12, verse 3. In you, Abraham, all the families, all the peoples of the earth shall be blessed. Jesus said, they will come from the east. They will come not to reveal himself to his descendants, Abraham's descendants exclusively, talking about how they want to grow their church. But what we often don't realize is that church growth is church growth in the first century. And he caused so much trouble because he was bringing people together that were very different. From all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. Did you catch the result of sin? Now, sin has created conflict and wars, such as, or was it a Rottweiler? I mean, think about it. In the very first pair of dogs, God created within colors and the different heights and everything in our physical, not only personality, particular people groups, and yet there will be no war, there will be no fighting in heaven. So I am in favor of multicultural churches. Multicultural churches requires a differentiation between tradition and universal principles. So in other words, we have to come to grips with the fact that the tie is root. I think we all do. But we have to differentiate between tradition and universal principles. Let me give you another example. Jesus did not preach with a pulpit, and he would have carried one everywhere he went. Do you see how we can easily confuse tradition with universal principles? Now, thankfully, this has never happened here, but in some churches I've been a part of, I think we need to be ready to take our stand no matter what the consequences are. But I don't want to fight over a pulpit. Respect for those who think and do things differently. Like I said, this is not easy. This is why Paul wrote so many letters. He was trying to help the churches navigate and figure this out. These three right here are necessary for a healthy marriage, not just a healthy church. Just end it here. I pray that God will, through the Spirit, unite us. I love unity. And I believe that so what a witness for God in the world today if we can well here with our little church and character by our united family that is different and yet